Hey there, friends. My name's Matthew. I'm the C# artisan, and this is the 9th video in my series on SendGrid. And I'm pretty sure this is going to be the last video in the series, unless I've goofed up and need to do a correction. And that happens. I don't always get everything right. So if you've noticed that I've made a mistake, or if there's new info and something has changed, please let me know. You can comment on these videos. You can write to me. It's csharpartisan@gmail.com, and I will take your comments seriously, and if need be, I will publish a correction. So today, we're going to talk about using SendGrid in Azure Functions as an output binding. And today's video is going to be a little odd because almost every video I've done shows you something that just is really cool and works great. Well, today I'm going to show you something that seemed like it had promise, but doesn't actually work. At least I couldn't get it to work. So I'm going to show you what I tried. I'll show you my struggles and maybe save you a little headache if you attempt to get this going. So what are Azure Functions, and what does it mean to have an Azure Function output binding? So Azure Functions are Microsoft Azure serverless compute paradigm. Basically, they're bits of code that spring to life in response to some event or trigger. So for example, on the input side, you can bind an Azure function to something like a service bus queue. And whenever a message goes into the queue, then your Azure function will spring to life and execute. You can also trigger an Azure function on a timer or as a result of an HTTP REST endpoint. So there are different ways on the input side to bind a function. And then an output binding is sort of an automatic way that the function can do something on the way out and trigger the next event. And it's not necessary to use them. Many very good Azure Function apps just respond to the input triggers and do their work, and then that's it. But sometimes you can chain them together and do interesting things, and that's what an output binding does. So for example, you can imagine writing an Azure function that triggers as a response to an HTTP post, and then it takes maybe the body of the post and deserializes it and looks at it and then writes it into a queue. Well, you could do the writing into the queue part as an output binding. So the idea here with SendGrid is that you could use SendGrid as the output binding. In other words, your Azure function would automatically send an email message using SendGrid in response to the trigger. So that's what we're going to try to get going. And well, you're going to see how it goes. So when I first heard that you could do SendGrid output bindings for an Azure function, I did a little searching and I quickly came upon this article in learn.microsoft.com that seemed to be exactly what I was looking for. Now, one thing to know about Azure Functions is there are two execution models. There is the older in-process model, and as you can see, support will end for this in November 10th, 2026. So new code should not use this. And I thought, well, we better use the new stuff. Let's use the isolated worker model. So I started following the instructions and I got down to the example section. And for the in-process model, there was a code example. And you can see here that our Azure function has this output parameter, which is a SendGrid message with this SendGrid attribute. So there's the declarative binding that should make it work. I thought, oh, this will be straightforward. So how do we do it for an isolated? And this was a little bit underwhelming. We don't currently have an example for using the SendGrid binding in a function app running an isolated worker process. So that was a bit of a bummer. I thought, well, are we just dead? And I kept searching around and I found this really nice article by a guy named Simon Holman. He's a great writer, good stuff. And this article, which is pretty recent, seemed to be exactly what I wanted. So kind of read through this and I knew that some stuff had changed, but it was going to be pretty close. And I thought, oh, I can follow this. So now let's switch over to Visual Studio, and I'm kind of going to give you the abbreviated walkthrough of how to get that going, and it's really not that difficult. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say New Project. We'll choose our Azure Functions project template, and we can call this SendGrid Binding Attempt. We will accept the default of .NET 8 isolated and the HTTP trigger. That's on the input side. That's just fine. And we can create this. And now we can actually go ahead and run it. So the Azure Functions debug environment is very cool. It lets you run stuff locally, and it emulates a lot of what you need. And in this case, it's going to bring up a console window. And because this is an HTTP trigger-based Azure function, we're going to get an endpoint that we can call. And I will set a breakpoint right here inside the actual function. We can open a new browser tab, and we can just do a get to that endpoint and cause our code to execute. So here we are running our Azure function. So F5, and welcome to Azure Functions. Everything is working. And we look in the console and you can see C# HTTP trigger function processed a request. So our Azure function is basically working. So now we need to do the SendGrid magic. So the first thing we need to do is add a couple of NuGet packages. And we can browse for SendGrid. That should do the trick. And the first one we need to add is the basic SendGrid library. And the next one is a little unusual. It is this one, Microsoft.azure.functions.worker.extensions.SendGrid. So let's go ahead and accept and install. So now we can make some changes to our function. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to add using SendGrid.helpers.mail, and we're going to change the return value of this to a SendGrid message. So it's no longer an out parameter in the new model. It's actually the return value. And this no longer works. So we can zap that. We'll be replacing it here. And then we need to add our SendGrid output binding attribute to the function like this. So this attribute tells the function that it needs to bind SendGrid and return the message. And it tells it how to get the SendGrid API key, which we're going to put in our our local.settings.json. So I've got it over here. And let me just copy it. And there you go. We have our SendGrid key. So now if I build this, it should build. It's just going to fail because we're not returning a SendGrid message. So we have to now create a SendGrid message. And if you've watched the tutorials, you should know how to do this. So I'm going to copy and paste some code, which ought to look very familiar to you. We'll start a new SendGrid message. I'm using this function called add_to. Now in the tutorials, I really emphasized using personalizations to add the recipients and their data. Here, since there's no data, we can just call this add_to. And I've got my from as my single sender, my validated sender, a subject, a plain text body, and we can return this message. So this should now work. So let's go ahead and run it. Takes a second to recompile all of this stuff. All right, here comes our console. And it's listening. So we'll go back to our browser. Oh, I cleared it. Let's see, let's go get our endpoint URL again. And a get should cause our code to execute. So here we go. We'll create the message and configure it and return it. All good, right? No, not good. And we have an error here that SendGrid is saying a to address must be specified. Now, you might be thinking, well, the problem was that I used a fake address for the to. That's not the problem. Even a real one, it doesn't work. It's a serialization problem. How do I know this? Well, reading more carefully through Simon's article, he actually says, hey, and if you get this error, go to my other article where he explains that the newer system.text.json is not serializing correctly and that we need to force it to use the JSON serializer instead. So he's got some instructions here. Again, things are a little different. I've kind of streamlined it slightly. So I got this going. Let me show you what I did. So the very first thing we need to do is add another NuGet package. And this one is a Newtonsoft package. And the one we want is you know what? Maybe I should just go look at the actual name. Microsoft at azure.core.newtonsoft. Where is that? Microsoft Azure Core Newtonsoft. There we go. That's the one we need. So we're going to apply that. Accept. And now we need to add a class to our project to handle this customization. So we'll add a class. And I'm going to call the class our worker configuration extensions. And I'm just going to copy and paste the code in the interest of time. So basically, it is going to tell us to create this JSON serializer settings object, configure it, and use that instead. And in our program now, we need to tell it to use this. So we'll say using SendGrid function app. Right before we configure our web app, we'll say builder.use Newtonsoft. So that should be great. So let's go ahead and build this. And that worked. So now we can run it. And once again, we'll wait for it to be listening. And now we can go and simply refresh our request here. So we are going to return our message, F5, and it still doesn't work. So what's going on? So we're getting this error. Okay, unless a valid template ID is provided, the content parameter is required, and there must be at least one defined content block. So I went and I looked at my code, and I am providing plain text content. Now, I tried HTML content. I tried using personalizations with plain text and with HTML and using substitutions and none. And I just could never get this to work. It just never did work. But what I did get working was using a template. So you kind of maybe remember what that looks like, where you take out the subject and you take out the plain text content and you say, template ID equals, and you give it your template ID. So with this setup, just like that, and a valid email, I was actually able to get it to send a message. But as soon as I attempted to add our string to object dictionary for our substitutions to actually put some information in the message, it succeeded, but the messages were never delivered. They just silently disappeared. So at the end of the day, you know, basically the point of this is having a relay where some information comes in to your Azure function. and you have an input, whether it's the body of the HTTP request or the content of a service bus queue message, whatever it is, and you're going to take that information and cook it into an email and send somebody an email, or send 1,000 people an email, or whatever this email relay needs to do. Maybe this message is supposed to send 1,000 emails. The problem is I haven't found a way to actually customize the content. All I can do is send templates that have the boilerplate with no data filled in. And when I attempt to do it myself without the template, it doesn't work. So I'm guessing this is yet another serialization problem. And probably if I cracked my head against it long enough, or called Simon Holman and asked him to help me, I probably need some help, we could sort it out. But basically at this point, I'm just going with it doesn't work. This is an edge use case. I can imagine wanting to use it, but I can't get it to work in any way that is useful. So there you go. Maybe you learned a few things about Azure Functions here, and you learned a little more about SendGrid, but sad to say that the SendGrid output bindings are a bit of a disappointment. If you figure this out, please send me an email, write me a comment, and let me know. I really would love to hear. Hey there, C# friends. Are you enjoying these videos and finding them helpful? I hope so. And if you are, please go ahead and like the video on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and feel free to leave a comment. I would love to hear from you.